They told us the Blackthorn name had been erased for our protection. But names don't vanish. Not when they're carved into the bones of Power Dot in 1851. A fire consumed the Blackthorn estate, or so the official story goes. But what they didn't tell you is that the fire didn't come from the outside. It came from beneath the earth, from the catacombs sealed off for over a century, catacombs that were never meant to be found again. When the local constable breached the cellar door 3 days later, they found no bodies. No blood, only silence, and a faint low hum vibrating through the stone like something alive was still listening. What followed was a blackout. Every report vanished. Every sketch, every letter, confiscated by agents who didn't wear uniforms. And the town that once thrived around the Blackthorn family line slowly emptied, as if cursed. But here's what they couldn't bury. A single leather-bound journal, hidden behind a false wall in the library, its pages soaked in cryptic Latin, drawings of rituals too precise to be fiction, and names of men who would go on to rule banks, churches, and entire governments. You've heard whispers of families that never die, only disappear, of bloodlines that trace back to empires older than Rome, of forces that don't hide in shadows, but wear them like armor. This is not folklore. It's not exaggeration. It's a wound beneath history's skin. And what I'm about to show you will make you question everything you've been taught about power, morality, and civilization itself. But I warn you, once you hear this, you cannot unhear it. This story doesn't just haunt. It hunts, and those who seek it rarely remain. The sane Dot, are you ready to descend? Because the story of the Blackthorn family isn't just a tale of corruption and silence. It is a blueprint, a dark architecture of control that still echoes in our world today. Let's begin in the year 1796, long before the fire, long before the name Blackthorn became a whisper wrapped in fear. There was a boy, Elias Blackthorn, born under a lunar eclipse so total the stars themselves seemed to vanish. The midwife who delivered him never spoke again. They say she saw something in his eyes, something older than a child should ever carry. The Blackthorn family claimed descent from Norman nobility, but their true legacy was far older, rooted not in European aristocracy, but in something far more primal. According to a sealed Vatican report smuggled out in 1911, the Blackthorn bloodline could be traced through ancient Sardinian cults, across the deserts of Persia, and into pre-pharaonic Egypt, each time changing names, hiding behind symbols, but always returning with a new mask of legitimacy. By the time Elias turned 14, he could recite entire volumes of esoteric philosophy in Aramaic. He spoke to things that weren't there. Birds died when he walked by. His tutors were brilliant men until they weren't. 3 were institutionalized. 1 took his own life, whispering, "The eye is open and the eye is cold." The family estate, located just outside of Providence, Rhode Island, was built atop something no one could explain. Geological surveys were inconclusive. Beneath its foundations lay a network of tunnels older than the state itself, some carved with markings that didn't match any known language. Others were smooth, like glass, as if heat, beyond comprehension, had shaped them. The Blackthorns never allowed guests below the 3rd floor. And yet, every decade without fail, certain figures arrived under cover of night. Men of letters, cloaked Jesuits, Eastern monks, and once a Rothschild, though the record of his visit was redacted in the British archives. Inside the house, rules were absolute: silence at sundown, mirrors covered. No one was to enter Elias' study, not even the staff. The consequences for disobedience weren't punishments. They were disappearances. And yet the family's influence only grew. Railroads, banks, courts, All found themselves beholden to Blackthorn investments. Laws were changed. Judges were influenced. Presidents received unmarked envelopes just before signing declarations of war. You think empires fall from greed? No, they fall when ancient contracts are broken, and the Blackthorns were enforcers of such contracts. There are certain names that should never be spoken aloud. Blackthorn is one of them, not because of what it means, but because of what it summons. By 1819, Elias Blackthorn had become a recluse. Officially, he'd suffered a nervous collapse following the death of his first wife. Unofficially, she was found in the woods near the estate, her body arranged in a geometric spiral, her eyes replaced with obsidian coins etched in a script only 3 people in the world could translate. All 3 translators were later declared mentally unfit and institutionalized within months of decoding the symbols. What they had deciphered wasn't a language. It was a formula. Not for science, for submission. After her death, Elias constructed the Blackthorn Oratory, a private chamber beneath the estate. No blueprints exist. No servant ever entered. But every month, at the dark of the moon, chanting could be heard rising from beneath the floorboards. Witnesses described the sound as neither human nor animal, but something in between. One stable boy who wandered too close was found 2 days later in a nearby barn, rocking and repeating a single phrase: "We do not summon them, we remember our place." From that year forward, Blackthorn family portraits began to change. The oil paintings, once typical, lifelike depictions, grew more symbolic. Elias appeared taller, his eyes darker. By the final portrait in 1831, his figure stood alone, faceless, arms outstretched, and behind him, a ring of flame and 11 veiled figures with hands over their mouths. Art historians called it a psychological breakdown rendered in brushwork. They were wrong. It was a warning. The 11 veiled figures were real, known in private diaries as the Silent Chorus. They were women daughters of other, powerful families, sent to the Blackthorn estate as part of an agreement spanning generations. No one knew their real names. They were never seen outside. But once a year, one of them vanished, and a new veiled girl arrived the following spring. No one asked where they came from. No one dared to ask where they went, because everyone in power, in finance, in politics, in religion, owned the Blackthorns. They didn't just pull strings. They held the knife that cut them. The deeper you go, the harder it is to return. But that's exactly why you're here. The Blackthorn family didn't rise through wealth alone. They rose through ritual. And their most sacred rite was never written down. It was passed through blood and silence. A silence so absolute that those who broke it were not punished, but erased, not just from life. From memory. In 1823, a former Blackthorn servant named Maribel Truss attempted to publish a pamphlet detailing her years working in the western wing of the manor. She claimed to have overheard things. Names whispered through the floorboards, dates, invocations. She even described a night when Elias Blackthorn stood outside in the pouring rain for over 6 hours, barefoot, hands raised, waiting for the 13th bell to toll. Her manuscript never made it to print. Days before publication, Maribel was found wandering a dock in Boston Harbor, mumbling numbers in Latin and trying to tear out her tongue with a rusted dinner fork. She died, too, weeks later in an asylum. Her final words were a whisper. "He is not a man. He is a throne." What did she mean? You see, Elias Blackthorn didn't see himself as a patriarch. He saw himself as a vessel, a seat for something older, something that required influence, systems, structure. From 1825 onward, every Blackthorn heir was placed in one of 3 institutions by the age of 7: the church, to master obedience; the courts, to master deception. The theater, to master illusion. By 1830, the family had embedded themselves in all three. They had bishops who owed them land, judges who owed them silence, directors who wove their messages into opera, stage and public spectacle. It was never just about wealth. It was about conditioning the public, teaching them which stories to believe and which truths to bury. Even you, right now, the world you think you know, has fingerprints smudged by their legacy. There's a reason stories like this are kept out of textbooks. They're not too grim. They're too revealing. And those who reveal too much ... don't last long. Still with me? They called him the mirror, not because he reflected truth, but because he reflected what you feared most. Nathaniel Blackthorn was born under a blood eclipse in the winter of 1834. The midwife claimed the room dropped 20 degrees when he took his first breath. The fire in the hearth went black. The dog outside let out one long, unnatural wail, and then was never seen again. From the moment he could speak, Nathaniel began asking questions no child should even comprehend. What makes a man believe? A lie? How do you change a memory without touching the mind? And most disturbingly, what would happen if I told the truth backwards? The Blackthorns didn't raise Nathaniel like a child. They raised him like a ritual instrument. He was tutored in forbidden psychology before he was 9. By 11, he could recite over 200 phrases used in Jesuit mind reformation. By 13, he had mastered the art of mirror interrogation, the practice of forcing subjects to confess by confronting them with their own distorted reflections. They didn't teach him to read books. They taught him to rewrite them. But Nathaniel was different, even by Blackthorn standards. He didn't want power. He wanted clarity. He began breaking the family's rules, slipping into forbidden parts of the manor, reading journals sealed in wax, asking why the third-floor wing was always locked after sundown, and why the west garden was salted every full moon. By the age of 15, Nathaniel had uncovered something even the elders feared: the Blackthorn Codex, a ciphered document said to contain the family's original pact. What he found inside wasn't a pact. It was a blueprint, a system for controlling populations through narrative engineering, using trauma, guilt, and repetition to remap human identity. A formula to overwrite belief systems without the subject ever realizing it. It changed him. He stopped speaking for 3 months. When he finally emerged from his silence, he was no longer the mirror. He was the architect. And the first thing he built was a theater of compliance, one so subtle the world would mistake it for culture. In Section 6, I'll reveal the unholy alliance that made it all possible, and how it shaped the institutions we blindly trust today. Still watching? You're deeper than most. Keep going. While you still can. It began with an agreement sealed not in ink, but in silence. In the autumn of 1851, 3 cloaked men arrived at the Blackthorn estate under cover of fog. They did not knock. They did not speak. They were expected. One bore the crest of the East India Company, though he claimed no allegiance to crown or commerce. Another carried with him a rolled parchment bearing the sigil of the Jesuit order, though he never bowed, never crossed himself, and never used the word God. The third, his presence was never documented. No name, no title, no shadow in photographs. But Nathaniel called him the archivist, and it was he who spoke first. What followed that night was not a meeting. It was an alignment. 3 ancient networks, each masters of control in their own spheres, commerce, faith, and memory, came together under one aim: to create a predictive doctrine. A system capable of not only controlling behavior, but preemptively shaping identity, before rebellion, before doubt, before desire even formed. They called it the doctrine of prefiguration. Its premise was disturbingly simple. Who you believe you are is just a story someone told you early enough, often enough, and with enough emotion attached to make it feel like your own thought. Nathaniel provided the structure. The Blackthorn Codex became its spine, but the Jesuits added rituals, embedding trauma into education through cycles of shame and obedience. The company contributed distribution, shipping subtle variations of the program into colonies, classrooms, and courtrooms. But it was the archivist who brought the most terrifying element of all, the oblique script, an ancient linguistic pattern pre-Sumerian, capable of embedding directives in stories, hymns, and even dreams. It bypassed conscious thought entirely. To read it was to be rewritten. Over the next 3 decades, hundreds of normal institutions were seeded with this doctrine. Boarding schools, asylums, reformed churches, children's hospitals. Each one a controlled experiment in compliance through design. The public saw charity. What they were witnessing was ritualized engineering. Nathaniel disappeared from public life in 1873. Officially, he died of fever. But survivors from his final congregation spoke of sermons that bled through walls, of dreams that lasted days, and of waking up in languages they had never learned. This wasn't religion. It wasn't politics. It was terraforming of the mind. In Section 7, we'll enter the Blackthorn Chapel itself, where architecture, symbolism, and sound were fused to manufacture belief and erase resistance. Brace yourself. The descent is only beginning. There is a reason why the Blackthorn Chapel was built without windows. Every inch of its interior, every angle, every material, every echo was calculated to sever your perception of time, of self, of external reality. Once inside, the body remained in this world, but the mind entered a realm crafted for one purpose, submission. It began with the floor, black, basalt imported from Anatolia, polished to such a shine that it reflected the ceiling above. On that ceiling, a massive inverted pentacle carved. From oak, each arm pointing toward a painted eye. This design was no accident. The reflection made it seem as though you were standing inside the pentagram, watched from all directions. The pews were arranged not in rows, but in a spiral. There was no front, no pulpit, just motion, slow, circular, inward. The deeper you went, the more compressed the space became. Walls began to curve. The air grew warmer. The flickering torchlight from behind hidden grates began to pulse in. Rhythm with your breath. It was here, in this descent of senses, that the induction hymn was sung. Written in the oblique script. The hymn could not be translated directly. Linguists who later attempted to decode it suffered from insomnia, hallucinations, and in 2 cases, suicide. But survivors of the chapel described the experience as being told who I was by something that knew me before I was born. The sound system, if you could call it that, was built into the walls. Tuning forks, resonant cavities, and whisper vents. The frequencies were not designed to entertain. They were tuned to theta waves, targeting that vulnerable space between consciousness and trance. And at the spiral center, beneath a dome carved with scenes of angels disrobing and serpents wearing crowns, stood the veiled lector. No one saw who spoke there. The voice came through fabric, layered with myrrh, smoke, and shadows. It did not shout. It whispered. Because if you lean in to hear the whisper, you're already submitting. Those who entered the chapel emerged changed. Some became zealous disciples. Others broke completely, dissociating, repeating fragments of the induction hymn in their sleep. One girl, just 13, carved the spiral pew design into her own arms and was found praying to a figure she called Mother of Mirrors. What was being worshipped inside the Blackthorn Chapel was never God. It was control itself, sacred, perfected. Deified. In Section 8, We unseal the sealed confessions of a caretaker who remained silent for 46 years, until her final breath, when she revealed what lay beneath the chapel floor, that her name was Elsbeth Ward. She was a servant, barely literate, brought into the Blackthorn estate at the age of 15 after her mother died from fever in the river slums of Norvale. She had no family, no protector, just a quiet demeanor and hands that never shook, even when handling broken glass. For 4 decades, Elsbeth worked in the Blackthorn chapel, cleaning, tending to the crypt flowers, laundering robes stiff with candle soot. To the family, she was invisible. To the girls, she was silent. But Elsbeth saw everything. She watched the spiral processions, memorized the verses of the induction hymn without understanding the language. She cleaned blood from the ceremonial basins. She was the one who locked the chapel doors at midnight, and the one who unlocked them before dawn. She kept silent until the night before her death. It was winter 1891. Elsbeth, now 60, summoned a priest to her bedside. Not a Blackthorn-approved cleric, they had their own, but a village man of no rank. She made him swear to write down every word, even the ones that didn't make sense. That document was hidden in the priest's Bible, rediscovered by accident. In 1947, when the church's foundations were being repaired, what it described was the vault beneath the chapel. There is no record of its construction, no blueprints, no mention in town archives. But Elsbeth claimed it could only be accessed through a trapdoor beneath the central altar, a heavy iron hatch, sealed with 3 locks and an incantation whispered by Bartholomew Blackthorn himself. Inside was not a crypt, it was a theater of inversion. Statues lined the walls, all of them faceless, save for one feature, their mouths, carved open in expressions of agony or ecstasy. Each held a bowl in their lap. Elsbeth said they were never empty, though she never saw anyone fill them. The floor was not stone, but salt, compacted with strange glyphs burned into it. And at the chamber's center, embedded in a circle of chains, lay what she called the mother's mirror. Not a mirror in the traditional sense. A dark oval, like obsidian, surrounded by children's teeth, hundreds of them. Elsbeth was forbidden from touching it, but sometimes, she swore it whispered back, only the crowned 5 were permitted inside, always men, always veiled, and always followed by a girl no older than 16. Elsbeth never saw those girls again. They were never mentioned by name in public, not in birth records, not in the ledgers of Blackthorn Holdings, not even in the cathedral's private books, which tracked marriages and deaths like scripture. But inside the mirror room beneath the chapel, their names were carved in a ring of bone, 5 symbols, earned deep into ivory, the crowned 5. Every generation of the Blackthorn bloodline selected 5 men, all between the ages of 12 and 17, to be initiated into the covenant. These weren't random heirs. They were groomed from birth, isolated, watched, tested for purity of mind and submission of will. Once chosen, they underwent the inheritance rite, an ancient ceremony involving bloodletting, silence, and the ingestion of something referred to only as the mother's gift. Elsbeth described it as a black oil kept in bone flasks, warm to the touch and bitter beyond imagination. Each boy would kneel before the mother's mirror, surrounded by the screaming-mouthed statues, and drink the oil. What happened next, defies reason. Some convulsed for hours. Others wept uncontrollably, whispering in tongues. A few, simply, went still, their eyes dilated, fixated on the darkness in the mirror. Bartholomew Blackthorn, always present, would lean in close and whisper, "You are no longer sons of man. You are vessels of the gaze." From that moment, the 5 were no longer individuals. They were bound in silence and secrecy, their identities erased from public life. They took vows never to marry, never to speak of the mirror, and never to question orders passed down through the family line. But here's what they did do. They infiltrated. One became a judge. One entered the treasury office. One rose through the clergy. One commanded Blackthorn's private shipping fleet. And one, always one, remained at the estate, guarding the chapel and ensuring the next generation of 5 would be properly chosen. These men did not grow old. They vanished before age 40, replaced silently, and their remains were never buried in public graves. Elsbeth said they were, kept beneath the estate, mummified, seated upright. Mouths sewn shut. She referred to them not by name, but by function. The key, the ledger, the voice, the vessel, and the eye. And it was the eye who stood at the center of the final ritual, the one that could not take place unless a girl of untainted descent was offered. Her name was Annalise Crane. She never spoke of the Blackthorn estate until she was 72 years old, racked with fever, slipping in and out of delirium in a state run. Hospice in upstate New York. A nurse, curious about the strange names and phrases the old woman mumbled in her sleep, recorded parts of it in a personal journal. That journal, kept hidden for decades, is how we know what Annalise endured. She had been taken in 1891, at age 14, from a Catholic orphanage in Boston. The nuns said a generous benefactor had offered to sponsor her education. There was no warning, no explanation. One morning, a black carriage arrived. She was handed a suitcase and a silver crucifix and told she was blessed beyond measure. What awaited her at Blackthorn was not education. The girls, 9 of them, were housed in what was called the Angel's Wing. It looked like a normal dormitory, but the windows were sealed from the outside. No letters in, no visitors. Each room had a mirror, large, oval, framed in black wood, and it was nailed directly into the wall. Annalise would later describe, hearing the mirrors hum at night, that the girls were given tea every evening, a bitter liquid that dulled their thoughts and made their dreams vivid, violent, and hard to remember. They weren't allowed to speak of the dreams. If they did, they were taken away, always at night, and never returned. 3 months in, Annalise watched her roommate, Clara, sit bolt upright in bed, begin muttering a language neither of them understood, and walk out the door with her eyes wide open. The door hadn't been unlocked. It had simply opened. Clara was never seen again. Every Sunday, the girls were led to the sanctum room, a black marble hall beneath the estate where the 5 stood in red robes. Bartholomew Blackthorn read from a scroll made of what looked like stitched skin. The ceremony always ended the same way. A girl would be chosen. She would kneel before the mirror, and the eye would place his hand on her shoulder. Annalise remembered the cold, not of his skin, but of the absence behind his touch. As if there was nothing human left in him at all. She was chosen once, but something interrupted the ritual. A mirror shattered. Every candle went out at once. And in the chaos, Annalise ran. What she described next, the nurse refused to write down. She said it made her teeth ache just to hear it. But she recorded one phrase Annalise repeated in the dark. Over and over, the mirror is not glass. It's a mouth. It wants to eat the world. The ritual was called the sealing to the outside world. It was masked as a midsummer gala, a lavish, elite-only gathering of scholars, clergy, and aristocrats who claimed to be preserving heritage. But beneath the laughter, the orchestras, the champagne, a second gathering unfolded far below, in the catacombs carved into the earth beneath Blackthorn Estate. Only 13 guests were allowed into the ceiling. No one could speak of it afterward, not because of a vow, but because those who tried either lost their ability to form language or died by their own hand What occurred during the sealing was documented only once in a scrawled manuscript, found decades later, hidden in a false panel behind a priest's confessional booth in Rhode Island. The writer never named himself. He simply called himself Witness 8. He wrote of a room lined in obsidian, lit only by 3 blood oil lamps. In its center stood a platform, and on it, a girl veiled, motionless, arms bound by crimson ribbons inscribed with glyphs that pulsed like veins. She was never older than 16. The guests sat in thrones of bone arranged in a circle. At exactly midnight, the Eye of Blackthorn entered the chamber, wearing a crown made not of gold, but of teeth. He carried the mirror. Not glass, polished obsidian, carved with indentations that shimmered like the surface of oil on fire. He called it the mouth of memory. Witness 8 said the mirror didn't show your reflection. It showed your bloodline's betrayal, the one ancestral crime that damned your name forever. Most wept, some screamed. One man tried to claw out his own eyes, but the girl was the focus. Bartholomew would place the mirror against her forehead, whisper a phrase no one could remember afterward, and then command the guests to watch. Witness 8 said her body would convulse. Her shadow would stretch, ripple, split. A second shadow would crawl out of her and stand beside her, taller, darker, with no face dot, and then the guests would make a choice: stay, or offer a name. A name meant protection, immunity, a blood tithe. Those who offered someone else's name, usually a child, a servant, or rival, left untouched. Those who didn't, their families were marked. Witness 8 ended his account with a warning. The Blackthorns do not sacrifice blood to preserve power. They sacrifice innocence to maintain the illusion of legitimacy. The seal is not for protection. It is a branding. Those marked by it become part of the system that cannot be undone. He included a list of families who had attended. Several were later found to have committed mass murder, fraud, or vanished entirely. One of them was a U.S. senator. Another was the founder of a major, New England University. None of them were ever tried. They called it the guest book, but it was no ordinary ledger. Bound in human skin and inked with oxblood and mercury, the Blackthorn guest book was said to contain the signatures of every soul who had participated in the sealing across 3 centuries. Not just their names, but their bloodlines, their oaths, their sins. For decades, the book was believed lost, a myth whispered in secret Masonic chambers and occult libraries in Prague. But in 1971, during a routine renovation of a decommissioned chapel in Vermont, construction workers discovered a sealed compartment behind the altar. Inside, a rusted lockbox, a crumbling red wax seal, and the unmistakable weight of something alive with memory. The Vatican took possession of the artifact within 72 hours. But before they could disappear it forever, one archivist, known only as D.A., made a microfilm copy of several pages and leaked them to a fringe theological researcher named Adrian Tellis. Tellis disappeared 3 months later, but not before mailing a single reel to a private investigator in Rhode Island. That reel, grainy, decayed, and burned at the edges, gave us our first glimpse into the ledger of the damned. On page 74 alone, 5 names stood out. Caleb Winslow, founder of the Providence Trust Bank. His institution financed the internment camps during the war. Elias Crow, inventor of a patent system for child correctional devices. 32 orphans died in his trials. Judith Keene, Mother Superior of the Hollow Sisters Convent. Dozens of girls vanished under her care. None were reported missing. Thomas Ewell, an early architect of Ivy Grove University. His secret fraternity, the Pale Chain, is now embedded in 5 Ivy League schools. And most chillingly, Gideon Blackthorn listed not as a guest, but as a host. Gideon's annotation was different. Written in an archaic Latin dialect, it Read, Domum perpetuae voluntatis, Ofero corpus, Ofero crucem, Ofero nomen, in aeternum serviet. House of the eternal will. I offer the body, I offer the cross, I offer the name. Let it serve forever. Forever. That single phrase may be the key to understanding why the Blackthorn bloodline still persists, why their estate never crumbles, why their descendants occupy quiet positions of vast influence, judges, financiers, cultural gatekeepers. They didn't sell their souls. They bound them into a system where legacy is currency and innocence is fuel. The guest book is not a record. It is a contract, and contracts, especially those sealed in blood and faith, do not expire. There was a page in the guest book blacked out, scorched at the edges, smeared with ash as if someone tried to erase not just ink, but memory itself. Page 113. No names were legible at first glance, just a deep, unnatural stain. But under spectral light, fragments reappeared. Not a name, but a symbol. A broken crown pierced by 7 nails. That emblem belonged to Thaddeus Blackthorn, the founder of the lineage, but more than that, the architect of something far more disturbing than a family legacy. Thaddeus wasn't just a landowner or a statesman or a merchant as the public records would have you believe. He was the originator of the rite of silence, a ritual so psychologically destructive that even the early Inquisition labeled it a heresy too perfect. In 1683, during the height of the colonial purges, Thaddeus Blackthorn hosted a gathering at the estate. Only 13 guests were invited. None were ever seen again. What followed wasn't murder. It wasn't sacrifice. It was assimilation. According to suppressed court records from 1701 records, locked in the Massachusetts State Archives under a false heading, Thaddeus had developed a method of exchanging voices. Not metaphorically, literally. The ritual involved sensory deprivation, linguistic distortion, and a hallucinogenic compound derived from black foxglove, administered while hymns in reverse Latin were played through vibrating copper coils. After 72 hours, the victim's personality, their voice, would fracture, break, and what remained could be rebuilt. But rebuilt as what? That's where the horror grows teeth, because those who passed the rite began to speak in patterns that did not match their age, origin, or education. Young girls spoke like dying philosophers. Illiterate men recited obscure Babylonian texts in perfect rhythm, and all of them referenced one name with reverence and fear, the Hollow Father. We now believe this was no god, no demon, but a code name for the intelligence behind the ritual. An ancient consciousness possibly unearthed during Blackthorn's trade expeditions through Mesopotamia, one that offered power in exchange for silence. And a vessel. The 13th name on that cursed page? Not Blackthorn, not Yule, not Crow. It was blank dot because the Hollow Father needed no name, only access through a willing host, through a family that would bind their bloodline to his will, generation after generation. You see, what happened at the Blackthorn estate was not a single moment of horror. It was a transfusion of ancient will into modern power, when the FBI finally gained access to the Blackthorn crypt in 1979, under the guise of investigating missing persons linked to a cold warrior occult. They were not prepared for what they found. There were no coffins, no bones, no evidence of burial. Instead, buried 67 feet below the eastern wing of the estate, they uncovered something far more disturbing. A perfectly circular room, 40 feet in diameter. No doors, no windows, no seams in the stone, just polished obsidian walls that seemed to drink in the light. And in the center, 21 chairs, carved from petrified wood, all facing one direction, not inward, as in a meeting or ritual, but toward a single black wall, each chair bore a name carved in Old English, some recognizable from the Blackthorn family tree, but others unknown. Names that appeared nowhere in U.S. Census records. Names written in a dead dialect that even linguistic AI struggles to reconstruct. And on the wall they faced no writing, no cross, no altar, just a deep concave dent, as if something had once pressed against it, hard, like a face or a head, or dozens of them. The FBI report was never released publicly. Only 2 agents survived the investigation, and both retired within 6 months, citing psychological trauma. One later published an anonymous memoir under a pseudonym. In it, he described a sound he heard while descending into the chamber, a hum, just beneath the range of hearing, that seemed to vibrate his spine. He wrote, "It wasn't just a sound. It was like something trying to remember itself through me." But the most chilling discovery came not from the chamber, but from what they found underneath it, a sealed pit, filled not with bones, but with mirrors, hundreds of them, shattered, warped, scorched at the edges, each one facing a different angle, as though someone had tried every possible orientation, as if attempting to reflect something back. You see, mirrors have always been symbolic gateways, not just reflections, but invitations. In Babylonian rites, cracked mirrors were said to trap fractured souls. And in one of the last surviving Blackthorn diaries, written by a woman named Eliza in 1732, she writes, "He comes when we stop speaking. He feeds on the silence. The others think prayer protects them, but I know the mirrors are the only thing that hold him in." The diary of Eliza Blackthorn, dated 1732, was long dismissed as the ramblings of a traumatized woman. Historians called her the Mad Daughter, a poetic label to contain what they could not explain. But when her diary resurfaced in a classified British intelligence archive in 1986, linguists and cryptologists found something terrifying: a mirrored alphabet system, a language meant to be read only through fractured glass. Each letter, reversed and angular, could only be decoded when viewed through a broken reflective surface. Not a whole mirror, not a polished one, but one damaged, one that had seen something. When MI5 analysts finally cracked the code, the diary's contents revealed more than just occult ramblings. They described specific techniques of psychological control, sleep pattern disruption, identity fragmentation, and most disturbingly, the use of ritual mirrors to erase core memories from children before the age of 9. The purpose? To manufacture obedience, to break the internal compass. And the Blackthorn family, Eliza claimed, had been perfecting this technique for over 2 centuries, long before K-Ultra, long before the Tavistock Institute. They didn't call it mind control. They called it grooming for righteousness. The rituals involved mirror mazes constructed in underground halls, not for torture, but for training. Children were led blindfolded through them, forced to memorize disorienting reflections while reciting prayers in reverse. Their only guidance? The voice of the instructor, broadcast from hidden speakers, layered with low-frequency binaural tones that altered consciousness and weakened memory retention. This wasn't punishment. It was preparation. One MI5 analyst, who later turned whistleblower, noted in his debrief, the mirrored alphabet isn't just encryption. It's architectural. It remaps the mind. Anyone trained in it develops compartmentalized thinking, able to lie without feeling they're lying, forget without knowing they've forgotten. The mirrored language of the Blackthorns wasn't just a cipher. It was a spiritual weapon. And Eliza, in her fractured clarity, warned future generations. When the glass shatters, the voices return. If you want to stay sane, never speak the truth into a mirror. That's how he learns your name. Now ask yourself, why would intelligence agencies preserve this diary secretly fund its translation, and incorporate its patterns into modern interrogation resistance training? Because the Blackthorns didn't die out. They scaled. They turned ritual into protocol. And the systems they pioneered now run quietly behind the veil of schools, churches, and even Silicon Valley startups. In the darkest halls of Britain's elite institutions, places like Eton, Harrow, and early Yale societies, there was a process spoken of only in code. Today we know it as character building, but in the early 18th century they called it unmurring. A refinement of the Blackthorn methods, it was not about breaking children physically. It was about disconnecting them from internal truth. The unmurring process was designed to overwrite personal identity, to make a child loyal, not to themselves, not to their family, not even to their faith, but to the order. How did they do it? They began with isolation. New initiates, often between the ages of 9 and 13, were stripped of personal belongings, placed in cold, windowless rooms lined with reflective surfaces, not polished mirrors, but warped metal plates. The idea was simple. Break the link between image and self. Next came the voice drills, repetition of phrases in reversed cadence while staring into these warped reflections. Hours on end, sleep was limited, food was functional, every human comfort replaced with ritual. Over time, the child's own face became foreign to them. The voice in their head no longer sounded like their own. But the core of the unmurring process? It wasn't torture. It was praise. Instructors, often dressed in ceremonial robes, would assign new names, symbolic titles, and speak to the child as if they were being reborn. They were told their past was a dream, that normal life was the illusion, that the outside world was full of mirrored lies designed to trap weak minds. By the end of the process, the child would perform tasks without question, endure pain without protest, and most disturbingly report fellow initiates who failed to comply. Believing it to be virtuous. We think cults are fringe. But what if the world's most powerful schools were simply high-functioning initiation machines? The Blackthorn legacy, once rooted in a cult ritual, had become corporate. Its mechanisms now hidden in HR training, military academies, Ivy League, hazing. Do you really think success just requires hard work? And here's where it gets darker. Survivors of this process, those few who escaped or deprogrammed themselves, describe waking nightmares, flashes of alternate names, false memories, triggered by sound cues, and a constant, knowing emptiness where their inner voice used to live. At the midpoint of this story, I ask you now to pause. If you've made it this far, you're not just watching, you're changing. You've crossed the veil. Comment below. I see through the mirrors. I see through the mirrors. Repeat it. Cement it. Let the algorithm record your awakening. Beneath the crumbling stones of Grimsby Abbey, where ivy now devours what piety once claimed, lies a vault untouched by sunlight for nearly 2 centuries. It was sealed not with mortar alone, but with intent, a deliberate burial of memory. And when that vault was finally opened during a restoration effort in 1972, the workers were told they'd discovered medieval storage. But what they found didn't belong to any recorded liturgy. Laid out in a pentagonal formation were 7 objects, each placed with ritualistic precision, each humming with the eerie resonance of hidden purpose. Among them, a silver mask with no eye holes, a leather bound codex written in reversed Latin, and a device, yes, a device made of brass, black glass, and a lattice of copper wires that modern engineers could not identify. It had no power source, yet it emitted heat. You see, the Blackthorn family weren't just manipulators of flesh and fear. They were early technologists of the human soul, what we now call neuro-linguistic programming. They called sigil voicing. What modern psychology terms dissociation, they described as shearing the self. The vault's central altar bore the sigil of the Fractum Lux, an order within the Blackthorn lineage believed to have combined alchemy, optics, and early electricity to accelerate the unmurring process. Let that settle in. This isn't just ancient cruelty. This is prototype programming spiritual firmware engineered in the name of elite continuity. One chilling theory, buried in an unmarked police file from the 1980s, claims that the Blackthorn device coding name, the Mirror Engine, was later reverse-engineered by a private defense contractor. Its resonance patterns, when broadcast at low frequencies, reportedly induced anxiety, confusion, and suggestibility in test subjects. The project was scrapped publicly, but quietly, its core frequency algorithm resurfaced in television signal testing in 1986, in early VR headset prototypes, and more recently, embedded in the user experience design of certain attention-maximizing platforms. We're not saying TikTok is a ritual. We're saying what powers it once was. The vault has since been resealed, the artifacts quietly dispersed to museums, yet none of them are on display. Ever wonder why? Because those items weren't meant to be studied. They were meant to be activated by those who knew the codes. The transcript of Patient 016BL, locked away for decades under the British Ministry of Defence's Crown Silence Protocol, begins with 6 words whispered in a dreamlike trance. They turned the mirror inside me. He was 43 years old, an Oxford-educated economist, a former MI5 analyst, publicly a quiet man with an ordinary past, privately fractured, fragmented, tormented by flashes of a childhood he could never fully recall, except in shards. Shards. Oath chanting beneath candlelight. Shards of a cold silver mask placed over his face. Shards of a man in crimson robes whispering, "You are the prism now." His birth certificate lists his school as Bellington Preparatory Academy, a prestigious boys' institution near Somerset. But when investigators cross-referenced alumni records from 1984 to 1987, his years of attendance, his name was missing, as if he'd never been there, or as if someone had erased him. The doctor overseeing his case, Dr. Naomi Thorne, noted that every time the patient was placed under guided hypnotherapy, his vitals spiked when shown a simple geometric shape, a 5-pointed star inside a circle, surrounded by eyes. The Blackthorn seal, he screamed. Not words, frequencies, and when slowed down and analyzed, those frequencies aligned with the same sound wave profile discovered in the Mirror Engine Vault in Grimsby Abbey. You're not hearing a ghost story. You're hearing neurological evidence. Ritual-induced trauma coded into the subconscious. As signal, what the patient remembered, piece by piece, was a night in late October 1985. A gathering of masked figures. The heat of copper wires wrapped around his arms. The voice of a woman calm, aristocratic, unmistakably British saying, "We only remove the soul's shadow, dear. You'll thank us when you're whole." This woman matched the voice of Elizabeth Blackthorn recorded, giving a eulogy in 1993, a known Blackthorn matriarch, presumed childless. The psychiatrist filed a request for further investigation. Within a month, her license was suspended. Her practice seized. She vanished. Patient 016BL, discharged to an undisclosed location. No forwarding records. No contact permitted. And yet, before he disappeared, he left a final note with his sister sealed in a red envelope dotted read, "When you look in the mirror, ask who's really watching." Comment, "The mirror is not mine," twice below if you're beginning. To understand, lock it in. Beneath the moss-covered hills of Inverary, in the desolate highlands of Scotland, lies a facility that appears on no official map, belongs to no recorded branch of government, and is protected not by law, but by bloodline secrecy. Locals. Whisper of strange lights flickering beneath the hills on moonless nights. Of low, harmonic humming that seems to rise from the soil itself. Of military trucks arriving under the cover of fog, only to disappear into the earth. This place known only to insiders as the Hollow Keep was one of the Blackthorn family's most jealously guarded assets. Constructed during World War II under the guise of high-frequency radar experimentation, it was, in truth, an intergenerational nerve center for identity manipulation, behavioral fragmentation, and spiritual sterilization. They didn't just want to study the mind. They wanted to sever it. Inside, researchers, most of whom were never seen again, worked under codey names like Oracle, Split, Mother Tongue. Their goal was to induce controlled dissociation in test subjects, usually children, breaking them into alternate personalities that could be programmed compartmentalized for elite utility, couriers, spies, assets with no memory of their actions, blank slates. With engineered loyalty, every subject was assigned a number, a color, a sigil. They were never called by name. This wasn't about science. It was a ritualized degradation of self, patterned off ancient Blackthorn rites dating back to the 13th century. One recovered blueprint, smuggled out by a dying technician, described Room 6, labeled only as Mirror Seed Chamber. Inside were 13 upright chairs arranged in a circle, each facing inward, surrounded by mirrored walls. The ceiling was a hexagonal lattice of reflective black obsidian, designed not just to reflect the physical form, but to distort identity. Make the self fracture. The technician claimed that subjects left Room 6 unable to recognize their own face. Some spoke in voices not their own. One girl, Gauge 9, reportedly said, "I was Sarah before the mirror. I'm Echo now." And the most disturbing note? These experiments didn't stop in the 1960s. They evolved, shifted into new forms: covert educational programs, therapeutic treatments, even elite boarding schools disguised as havens for gifted children. One of them still operates today. And yes, there is footage. In 1997, a former intelligence contractor known only by his initials, ER, entered the abandoned facility beneath the Highlands, using stolen clearance codes tied to a long-defunct MI6 psychological research division. What he captured on his concealed body cam was never meant for public eyes, but a single tape made its way into the hands of a fringe historian in Aberdeen, who later died in a fire labeled accidental electrical fault. A footage survived. It opens with grainy night vision, damp stone corridors, walls etched with sigils, not carved, but burned into the stone with something chemical. As ER passes each symbol, the Geiger counter in his coat begins ticking faster, though. No known radioactive materials were supposed to be present. Then he finds it. Room 6, the Mirror Seed Chamber. It's exactly as described in the smuggled blueprint: 13 chairs arranged in a perfect circle, each bound with worn leather restraints. On the floor, fragments of shattered mirrors, but not random. Every piece appears to have been deliberately broken along specific fault lines. Sigils etched into the glass shimmer faintly, as though still absorbing something residual. ER steps into the center of the circle. His breath fogs the lens. Though he says the air is warm. Then comes the whisper. Not on the tapes. Audio inside his head. He described it later in a handwritten journal entry that ended abruptly mid-sentence. Voices. Not human, not external. Felt like they were assembling me differently, piece by piece, inside my own skull. Like I wasn't leaving the room, like the room was entering me. Then, the lights flare briefly and the camera's feed distorts. For exactly 6.66 seconds, the video shows 13 children standing behind each chair. motionless, watching, blurred, expressionless. Then gone. The footage ends with ER's final. Words whispered so faintly you'd miss them without enhancing. They're not making soldiers. They're making hollow gods. ER was never seen again, but a fragment of his journal was recovered from a safe deposit box in Inverness. The final page read, "I looked in the mirror and saw not myself, but all the others they made before." This isn't folklore. This is a blueprint for identity erasure wrapped in ritual, fueled by elite necessity. And now it's spreading. In the next section, we will descend deeper, not into the past, but into the now. Because the Blackthorn legacy didn't die in that room. It went digital. They called it the Blackthorn Protocol. By the early 2000s, the rituals once confined to the stone basements of Blackthorn Manor had been transcribed, not into parchment, but into code. A proprietary neuro-linguistic sequencing algorithm disguised as a behavior mapping tool. Developed under the guise of academic research at a European university, it was secretly backed by a private defense firm. The goal? Not control in the old sense, not chains, not threats. Alignment. The protocol could read your digital behavior search. Terms, dwell time, click delay, facial microexpressions through webcams. And then it spoke back to you. Whispers, patterns, reinforcement loops. It didn't need to convince you. It simply reshaped the framework of your desire. Over time, users began reporting vivid dreams. Same symbols, same chant, same 13 faces. Coincidence? Not possible. The core script was nicknamed Thorn OS, and while its public shell was marketed as a motivational A, the real application was tested on targeted male demographics across 3 Western countries. Age range? 18 to 69. And the result? Radical shifts in moral alignment, detachment from previous identity, willingness to accept new authority without question, as long as it wore the right aesthetic of strength. But here's the part thing ever. Wanted leaked? Thorn.os was trained on audio harvested from Blackthorn rituals recorded in 1928, the infamous phonograph cylinders smuggled out by defectors from the order. Those same recording sigils and sound were fed into the voice model of the protocol. So when you heard that ad that gave you chills, when you scrolled past that video and something inside you paused, that was the voice of Blackthorn. Not metaphorically, literally. And it's still running. Not underground, not hidden, right here. Right now, on your phone, in your browser, beneath your consciousness. That's the brilliance of it. They don't have to convince you. They only have to weaken the gate. Now listen closely. If you've made it this far, you've already been selected. The gate has opened. But there's still a way to claim your own name before it's overwritten. Comment below twice this phrase. No one owns my mind. Twice. To lock it in. To signal the algorithm that you are not hollow. Not yet. Because from this point forward, the descent begins. There is a reason the Blackthorn family vanished from public record after 1947. It wasn't because they died. It was because they transformed. No longer bound to flesh or bloodline, the Blackthorn legacy became a pattern, a structure, a fractal of control embedded in institutions, in architecture, in systems. Their bloodline wasn't extinguished. It was abstracted into positions of influence, unseen but orchestrating. Take a moment. Think about the last time you felt like something wasn't right, like the world had shifted, just slightly off-center. You felt watched, not by a person, by a system that knew you too well. That's the afterimage of Blackthorn. You're not paranoid. You're remembering something your conscious mind was programmed to forget. By the time the CIA's MK-Ultra program hit its peak in the 1960s, several Blackthorn descendants were deep inside the machine, disguised as behavioral scientists, linguists, even clergy. They weren't experimenting. They were implementing. What began as ritual, physical, bloody, localized, was now spiritual in code, in doctrine, in media. They learned. Why force control when you can create compliance through meaninglessness? Step 1. Flood every mind with contradiction. Glorify consumption while demeaning purpose. Push hypersexualization, anti-intellectualism, tribalism. Starve the spirit, but overfeed the ego. Step 2. Simulate choice. Let people argue over two heads of the same beast. Left versus right. Safe versus dangerous. God versus science. They controlled both sides. Step 3. Seed despair. Disguise obedience as safety. Disguise slavery as success. Make rebellion feel futile and compliance feel like peace. That's the final evolution of the Blackthorn method. A world where the prison is invisible and the prisoner believes they are free. They were never just a family. They were a formula, passed through blood, then power, then language. And now, you are standing at the gates of the oldest truth. The chains that bind you were built with your own hands. But so was the key. Keep listening. Because in the next section, we descend into the origin ritual, the one that birthed the protocol and cursed the bloodline forever. The night the veil was torn, and a god without a name answered back. In 1997, a former intelligence contractor known only by his initials, E.R. entered the abandoned facility beneath the Highlands, using stolen clearance codes tied to a long-defunct MI6 psychological research division. What he captured on his concealed body cam was never meant for public eyes. But a single tape made its way into the hands of a fringe historian in Aberdeen, who later died in a fire labeled accidental electrical fault. The footage survived. It opens with grainy night vision, damp stone corridors, walls etched with sigils not carved, but burned into the stone with something chemical. As E.R. passes each symbol, the Geiger counter in his coat begins ticking faster, though. No known radioactive materials were supposed to be present. Then he finds it. Room 6, the mirror seed chamber. It's exactly as described in the smuggled blueprint. 13 chairs arranged in a perfect circle, each bound with worn leather restraints. On the floor, fragments of shattered mirrors, but not random. Every piece appears to have been deliberately broken along specific fault lines. Sigils etched into the glass shimmer faintly, as though still absorbing something. Residual E.R. steps into the center of the circle. His breath fogs the lens. Though he says the air is warm. Then comes the whisper. Not on the tapes. Audio inside his head. He described it later in a handwritten journal entry that ended abruptly mid-sentence. Voices. Not human, not external. Felt like they were. Assembling me differently, piece by piece, inside my own skull. Like I wasn't leaving the room, like the room was entering me. Then, the lights flare briefly, and the camera's feed distorts. For exactly 6.66 seconds, the video shows 13 children standing behind each chair. Motionless. Watching. Blurred. Expressionless. Then gone. The footage ends with E.R.'s final words, whispered so faintly you'd miss them without enhancing. They're not making soldiers. They're making hollow gods. E.R. was never seen again, but a fragment of his journal was recovered from a safe deposit box in Inverness. The final page read, I looked in the mirror and saw not myself, but all the others they made before. Me. This isn't folklore. This is a blueprint for identity erasure wrapped in ritual, fueled by elite necessity. And now it's spreading. In the next section, we will descend deeper, not into the past, but into the now. Because the Blackthorn legacy didn't die in that room. It went digital. They called it the Blackthorn Protocol. By the early 2000s, the rituals once confined to the stone basements of Blackthorn Manor had been transcribed not into parchment, but into code. A proprietary neuro-linguistic sequencing algorithm disguised as a behavior mapping tool. Developed under the guise of academic research at a European university, it was secretly backed by a private defense firm. The goal? Not control in the old sense, not chains, not threats, alignment. The protocol could read your digital behavior search. Terms, dwell time, click delay, facial microexpressions through webcams. And then it spoke back to you. Whispers, patterns, reinforcement loops. It didn't need to convince you. It simply reshaped the framework of your desire. Over time, users began reporting vivid dreams, same symbols, same chant, same 13 faces. Coincidence? Not possible. The core script was nicknamed Thorn OS, and while its public shell was marketed as a motivational A, the real application was tested on targeted male demographics across 3 Western countries. Age range? 18 to 69. And the result? Radical shifts in moral alignment, detachment from previous identity, willingness to accept new authority without question, as long as it wore the right aesthetic of strength. But here's the part they never wanted leaked. Thorn.os was trained on audio harvested from Blackthorn rituals recorded in 1928, the infamous phonograph cylinders smuggled out by defectors from the order. Those same recording sigils and sound were fed into the voice model of the protocol. So when you heard that ad that gave you chills, when you scrolled past that video and something inside you paused, that was the voice of Blackthorn. Not metaphorically, literally. And it's still running. Not underground, not hidden. Right here. Right now. On your phone. In your browser. Beneath your consciousness. That's the brilliance of it. They don't have to convince you. They only have to weaken the gate. Now listen closely. If you've made it this far, you've already been selected. The gate has opened. But there's still a way to claim your own name before it's overwritten. Comment below twice this phrase, "No one owns my mind." Twice to lock it in. To signal the algorithm that you are not hollow. Not yet. Because from this point forward, the descent begins. There is a reason the Blackthorn family vanished from public record after 1947. It wasn't because they died. It was because they transformed. No longer bound to flesh or bloodline, the Blackthorn legacy became a pattern, a structure, a fractal of control embedded in institutions, in architecture, in systems. Their bloodline wasn't extinguished. It was abstracted into positions of influence, unseen but orchestrating. Take a moment. Think about the last time you felt like something wasn't right, like the world had shifted, just slightly, off-center. You felt watched, not by a person, by a system that knew you too well. That's the afterimage of Blackthorn. You're not paranoid. You're remembering something your conscious mind was programmed to forget. By the time the CIA's MK Ultra program hit its peak in the 1960s, several Blackthorn descendants were deep inside the machine, disguised as behavioral scientists, linguists, even clergy. They weren't experimenting. They were implementing. What began as ritual, physical, bloody, localized, was now spiritual in code, in doctrine, in media. They learned. Why force control when you can create compliance through meaninglessness? Step 1. Flood every mind with contradiction. Glorify consumption while demeaning purpose. Push hypersexualization, anti-intellectualism, tribalism. Starve the spirit, but overfeed the ego. Step 2. Simulate choice. Let people argue over 2 heads of the same beast. Left versus right. Safe versus dangerous. God versus science. They control both sides. Step 3. seed despair. Disguise obedience as safety. Disguise slavery as success. Make rebellion feel futile, and compliance feel like peace. That's the final evolution of the Blackthorn method. A world where the prison is invisible, and the prisoner believes they are free. They were never just a family. They were a formula, passed through blood, then power, then language. And now, you are standing at the gates of the oldest truth. The chains that bind you were built with your own hands. But so was the key. Keep listening. Because in the next section, we descend into the origin ritual, the one that birthed the protocol and cursed the bloodline forever. The night the veil was torn, and a god without a name answered back. It happened in 1666, the year of fire, the year of plague, the year the veil tore open in a manner built not by architects but by intention. Blackthorn Keep, not just a home, but a structure designed to bind something ancient. Constructed in precise alignment with the ley lines that cut across old England like veins beneath flesh, the keep was engineered with one purpose: to house a ritual older than any kingdom. The last remaining journals of Elias Blackthorn archived in a restricted vault beneath. Edinburgh speak of a rite called the Covenant of 13 Veils, a ceremony that required a child born of incest, a mirror made from volcanic glass, 13 breaths from a dying saint, and the sigil of the unknowing one, etched in blood from the base of the spine. The covenant was not meant to summon. It was meant to exchange, one mind for another, one will for a system. Elias believed the world was governed by entities beyond time, what he called the architects of consent. They did not demand worship. They demanded structure, obedience, echo, repetition. On the night of the ritual, the Blackthorn patriarch offered his body as the vessel, but the entity that answered ... was not what he expected. The manor shook. Witnesses, only 3 survived, spoke of black rain falling upward, screams that emerged from inside walls, and a light so bright it left them blind, but still able to see what came next. The next morning, Elias Blackthorn was found standing, alone in the garden, eyes white, voice gone, smiling. He never spoke again. But from that day forward, the Blackthorn lineage shifted from nobility to influence, from landed wealth to intellectual domination. It was as if something else had entered the family line. Not just a demon, but an operating system. An invisible algorithm running silently behind the Blackthorn name. The ritual wasn't to call forth a god. It was to install a principle, one that still governs us today. Control is not taken. It is offered. And they taught the world to offer it willingly, repeatedly, with pride. In the next section, we decode how this ritual birthed the very blueprints of modern education, psychiatry, and surveillance, all rooted in the Blackthorn's covenant. With the nameless void, you're not just watching history. You're watching the source code behind your reality. Most believe the mind is shaped by environment, but the Blackthorns knew better. They didn't just study behavior. They engineered it. In 1682, less than 2 decades after the Covenant of 13 Veils, Elias Blackthorn's grandson, Silas, founded the Institute for Cognitive Refinement, a school cloaked in charity, but built for one purpose: to rewrite the self. Students were selected from orphanages across Britain. No family, no records, no risk. They were brought into a program that blended classical education with isolation chambers, sleep disruption, and something called mirror reinforcement. Each student was paired with a double lookalike trained to mimic their behavior. Subtly, over time, the student's identity was confused, merged, until they no longer knew if they were the subject or the reflection. And that was the point. To erase certainty, to make the mind pliable, to replace identity with interface. In a now-buried parliamentary inquiry from 1741, a whistleblower described how Blackthorn graduates were placed into key positions of society, clergy, judges, physicians, not to serve, but to observe, not to heal, but to filter. See, what the Blackthorns understood, and what no one dared admit, was that mass control doesn't require force. It requires predictability, and predictability begins with belief. So they seeded beliefs that deviation was madness, that silence meant shame, that suffering built virtue. The Institute's methods: paying reward pairing, script reinforcement, dual reality exposure, formed the unacknowledged backbone of what would one day be called psychology. Not the science of healing, the science of containment. Look around you. The assessments, the diagnostic manuals, the norms. These were never meant to liberate the human mind. They were meant to map it, to model it, to flatten it into something manageable. What began in Blackthorn chambers now echoes in every padded room, every school desk, every algorithm that predicts your preferences before you even speak. Do you really think the system wants you to awaken? Of course not. It wants you calibrated. And in the next section, we reveal how the Blackthorn doctrine crossed the Atlantic, shaping America's first mental hospitals, elite prep schools, and the hidden hand behind MK-Ultra. This is no longer history. This is a reality audit. By the mid-1800s, the Blackthorn legacy had crossed the Atlantic. But it didn't arrive with fanfare. It arrived embedded in blueprints, in books, in bloodlines. The first U.S. foothold was not political. It was institutional. In 1847, beneath the moss-covered bluffs of upstate New York, a secluded estate known as Cedar Hollow was converted into the American Academy for Behavioral Correction. To the public, it was a progressive school for troubled boys. But inside, it was the Blackthorn method perfected. Children were enrolled under court order: orphans, runaways, the discarded. And they were subjected to a ritualized cycle: isolation, indoctrination, implantation. Each boy was assigned a guardian and adult handler who played the role of mentor and savior. The boys were taught that their only chance at redemption was total obedience. Punishment wasn't physical, it was emotional. Love withdrawn, approval revoked, until the boy begged to comply. Records reveal the use of sensory deprivation tanks, dream recording journals, and early prototypes of what we now recognize as voice-to-skull technology. This was before Tesla, before MK-Ultra, before anyone knew what to call it. But the fingerprints were always the same. In 1873, Dr. Malcolm Ashcroft, a former physician at Cedar Hollow, confessed on his deathbed, "We did not educate them. We rewrote them. They were made to forget what it meant to be human." That was the point. The Blackthorn framework was now fully Americanized, and it didn't stop at Cedar Hollow. It leaked into Danvers State Hospital, where new therapies tested obedience thresholds, Phillips Exeter Academy, where elite children were trained in coded speech and doublethink, and most disturbingly, into government laboratories under the War Department, long before anyone knew the acronym CIA. When MK-Ultra was exposed in the 1970s, journalists thought they had uncovered the roots of psychological manipulation. But they were wrong. What they found was just a branch. The root was Blackthorn. Now understand this. These programs were not abandoned. They were renamed, repurposed, rebranded as innovation, self-improvement, wellness. But their goal has never changed. Control the narrative of the self. Make you doubt what's real. Because a man who doubts his own mind will obey any voice louder than his own. And in the next section, we uncover the symbol, the Blackthorn. Seal hidden in plain sight on medical institutions, Ivy League crests, and even federal emblems. The signal of allegiance to a system older than the nation itself. It starts as a flourish on a crest, a vine twisting around a sword, an ivy, leaf beside an open book, a black branch behind a silver crown. Most overlook it. But once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. The Blackthorn seal, a seemingly decorative emblem that has quietly appeared in over 200 institutional logos throughout the Western world, universities, medical boards, military think tanks, even pharmaceutical companies. But it isn't decoration. It's declaration, a mark of allegiance to an ancient philosophy. Those who control the mind must first control the myth. The seal's origins trace back to 1611 first, etched into the stone floor of Blackthorn Manor's Hall of Reflection. It was a private doctrine then, known only to initiates of the fifth chamber. The branch, always twisted counterclockwise, symbolized disruption of linear thought. The crown not monarchy, but dominion of intellect. And the serpent, sometimes coiled around the base, represented the wisdom that bites before it speaks. Over time, the seal evolved, adapted. A quiet sigil passed between the chosen. When Harvard Medical School redesigned its shield in 1906, they claimed it was based on classical motifs. But archival sketches show early drafts featuring the same three-veined black branch entwined with a rod knot of Asclepius, but of control. In 1932, the Tavistock Institute in London, pioneers of psychological warfare, chose a near-identical seal for their internal memos. Not public, private, for staff eyes only. What does this mean? That beneath the visible structures of education, science and policy lies a network of silent architects, bound not by ideology, but by methodology. They don't care what you believe, only that your beliefs were given to you. Because the moment you start asking why you believe what you believe, you begin to slip from their grasp. And that is the greatest threat of all. Look again at the institutions you trust most, their logos, their language, their rituals. You'll see the signs, not because they want you to, but because they never thought you would look. But you are looking now. You're remembering, and soon you'll begin to see how these institutions weren't corrupted. They were created for this purpose. In the next section, we go deeper into a training manual recovered from the wreckage of Blackthorn's Parisian archive. A manual that outlines the 3 levels of obedience and how each one was designed to fracture identity. You won't walk away from this the same. Paris, 1947. A fire ravaged the Rue des Martyrs district, consuming an abandoned manor that had stood silent since the end of the war. Amidst the ashes, firefighters uncovered something they weren't meant to find. A charred leather satchel, sealed in wax with the Blackthorn crest. Inside pages warped from heat. Ink bleeding at the edges was a training manual labeled simply Doctrine of Dominance, a manual of behavioral design. It had no author, no publisher, no indication of who it was intended for, but its contents were surgical. The manual outlined 3 levels of obedience, a psychological architecture used to shape, fracture, and reform the human identity without the subject ever realizing it. Let me walk you through them. Level 1, Surface Conditioning. This is the realm of routine. Bells in schools, calendars, uniforms, repetition disguised as structure. The goal? Surrender of personal rhythm to institutional time. Once your days belong to them, your thoughts follow. Most people remain at this level their entire lives, never realizing they've already submitted. Level 2, Internal Displacement. Here, identity is reframed through guilt and gratitude. You should be thankful. You owe us everything. This is how charity becomes leverage. Education becomes indoctrination. Subjects are taught to associate their very survival with obedience. They begin to police themselves, silencing their own doubts before an enforcer ever needs to step in. Level 3, Symbolic Absorption. This is the final stage where the subject doesn't just comply, but begins to identify with the system itself. The institution becomes family. The crest becomes pride. Dissent becomes unthinkable, not because it's dangerous, but because it feels disloyal. This level breaks lineage, memory, and loyalty to anything outside the order. And here's the most chilling part. The manual wasn't theoretical. It included case studies pages redacted, names blacked out, but the structure was unmistakable. One entry simply titled Salem -1813 described a group of adolescent subjects placed into ritualized obedience using sleep deprivation, music cycles, and what it called negative imprint bonding. Another, Bruxelles -1891, noted successful implementation of Phase 3 compliance using only 17 days of symbolic immersion. This wasn't a new phenomenon. This was a refined art. And if this was what they were writing down, imagine what was never written at all. In the next section, I'll show you the name buried deep in a Vatican archive that connects the Blackthorn family not just to these psychological systems, but to the Council of Worms itself. You'll begin to understand this isn't just manipulation. It's a legacy of spiritual engineering that the Council of Worms, 1122, most known as a political religious treaty, an agreement between Pope Calixtus II and Emperor Henry V to end the investiture conflict. But buried beneath that public negotiation was a private conclave closed to all but 13 men. And among those 13, a name faint, faded in the margin of a vellum transcript stored in the Vatican secret archives. M. de Blackthorn. No title, no region, just a sigil next to the name, a bleeding tree wrapped in thorns. That symbol would later appear in the wax seal of the Parisian Doctrine Manual. It wasn't coincidence. It was continuity. The Blackthorn family wasn't noble in the traditional sense. They were architects, not of castles, but of control. And the Council of Worms? That wasn't just about who appoints bishops. It was about who controls human access to the divine. See, this investiture debate masked a deeper war, whether kings or priests would govern the minds of men. But the Blackthorn proposition was darker still. What if the priest and the king became the same thing? A single figure, cloaked in ritual, empowered by law, capable of claiming both eternal salvation and temporal punishment. That's what Blackthorn offered. A blueprint for psychospiritual unity. Their model? Not Rome, not Jerusalem, but Babel, where language, law, and power were one, and their method was terrifyingly simple. Control the rights. Control the rights. If you wanted to marry, you needed their priest. If you wanted to inherit land, you needed their blessing. If you wanted to speak to God, you had to speak through them. What the council enshrined wasn't compromise. It was the formalization of the gatekeeper class, the embedding of Blackthorn's philosophy into every cathedral, monastery, and court across Europe. And if you're wondering, why would a family do this? Why seek such dark mastery? Because the Blackthorns believed in a singular truth. Freedom is chaos. Order requires control. And the highest form of love is dominion. That was etched onto the final page of the Doctrine of Dominance. Not as a warning, as a mission statement. In the next section, you'll see how the Blackthorns passed this legacy through initiation rites disguised as philanthropy, and how their descendants quietly engineered institutions that still shape the minds of men today. We're born into a system they helped build. Now you're starting to see it, and there's no going back. There's a reason elite families never die. They transmute. When the Blackthorn name disappeared from public registers by the late 1600s, it wasn't extinction. It was evolution. You see, the truly powerful don't fight to stay visible. They fight to become invisible, to exist as influence, not identity. And that's exactly what the Blackthorn bloodline did. They abandoned the manor, but kept the mechanism. Instead of lording over villages, they embedded themselves in academies, medical boards, religious orders, and policy think tanks, each bearing no sign of the old name, but all pulsing with the same doctrine: dominion through benevolence, control through care. By the early 1700s, their symbols reappeared, not on shields, but on institutional crests. The bleeding tree of thorns was reimagined as a staff of healing. Sound familiar? Look closely at the logos of Western medicine, certain universities, even. The robes of clergy in specific orders. They've replaced the family, but kept the philosophy. Charity became a mask. Hospitals were used to test behavioral conditioning under the guise of care. Schools became centers not of empowerment, but obedience structured, to reward silence, routine, and memorization of state-approved truth. And philanthropy? A lever to mold entire generations with guilt, shame, and dependence. This is how power survives. Not through armies, but architectures of belief. And the most chilling detail? Their initiation rites continued, but instead of secret chambers, they took place in executive boardrooms and elite retreats. Rituals not of blood sacrifice, but of ideological fusion. Candidates were tested on whether they would obey in public, question in private, and act without conscience. Accept collective control over individual autonomy for the greater good. And most importantly, protect the source, even unto death. These aren't rumors. These are confirmed patterns in closed-door elite circles, traced through archived correspondences, redacted meeting minutes, and whistleblower accounts buried by legacy media. If you've ever felt like certain institutions aren't designed to help you, but to reshape you, you're not paranoid. You're waking up. And if you're still here, I want you to comment this phrase twice. Order is not truth. Awareness is freedom. It's not just engagement. It's a signal to yourself and others. You're not just watching a video. You're crossing a line. There is a chamber beneath the old Blackthorn estate, sealed now, overgrown by vines and time. But those who dared to enter before it was locked away reported something that still sends chills through. Scholars of the arcane. Mural 20 feet wide painted in human ash and wine. It depicted a tree whose roots wrapped around a man kneeling in chains, his eyes gouged out, a crown hovering just above his head. The inscription beneath? He who sees not rules best. It was their final lesson. Blind obedience wasn't for the masses. It was for the rulers themselves, because the Blackthorn doctrine wasn't simply about control of others. It was about engineering a system so perfect, so absolute, that even those in charge became slaves to the machine they built. Think about it. Bankers who no longer understand the debt system they oversee. Judges who follow laws written by ghostwriters from foundations they've never heard of. Presidents who read speeches authored by unelected technocrats, trained by ivy-covered seminaries of control. This is the legacy of Blackthorn, not a family, but a framework. A machine so elegant, it no longer needs human hands, but somewhere hidden, deep in private libraries and encrypted files, the original algorithms of that machine still exist. Psychological formulas, behavioral models, emotional triggers designed to evoke compliance at scale. This wasn't guesswork. It was decades of ritualized trial, often performed on the most vulnerable. Orphans, prisoners, mental patients. And it worked. They learned to manipulate memory, identity, even the very concept of truth. You don't need whips or chains when the prisoner builds his own cell. Look at today's world. People voluntarily tracking themselves, voluntarily silencing dissent, voluntarily punishing each other for deviation from consensus. This is the final form of the Blackthorn ideal, self-replicating control. But here's the truth they never wanted you to hear. Once you see the tree, it's Branches in media, education, religion, even relationships. You can refuse to water it. You can burn the roots. And what comes next is something the Blackthorns could never predict. A man who sees and still chooses to rule you. You might be that man. They always feared one thing, the outlier who remembers what was erased. Not a warrior, not a priest, but a witness. A man who doesn't just hear the tale ... but feels the patterns, connects the sigils, sees through the pageantry of false freedom. Are not here by accident. You were led by a scar in your psyche, a whisper in your blood that said, something isn't right, and hasn't been for centuries. You're feeling it now, aren't you? The weight, the familiarity. As if this Blackthorn tale wasn't just a story, but a mirror, because every generation has its Blackthorn. The family name changes, the architecture upgrades, but the purpose remains: harvest potential. We shape identity. Feed the system. It's why gifted children are medicated instead of mentored. Why spiritual hunger is pathologized. Delusion. Why noble rage is redirected into sterile outrage machines online, never into real-world disruption. They've mastered the art of burning out rebels by making them feel crazy for seeing clearly. The most dangerous knowledge? Not what they did, but how they did it so cleanly. Through silence, through beauty, through language engineered to pacify. Academy, therapy, mission, trust, foundation. Beneath these words, the old thorns, sharpened by time. And now, here you are no longer a passive listener, but a bearer of something dangerous. Cognition outside the code. You've passed the mirror test. You're not a beast echoing belief. You're a man beginning to wield awareness as a weapon. So ask yourself, what parts of your life were chosen for you? Which thoughts in your head are truly yours? And most importantly, what have you been trained not to question? That's the crack in this system. That's where the roots rot. And from that fracture, a new pattern can grow if you're willing to burn what they built. They will call you mad. They will call you paranoid. They may even try to break you. Let them, because nothing terrifies thee. Architects of the prison more than the man who learns to walk through walls. Now you understand why this story was buried, not just in libraries, but in your very psychology. The Blackthorn legacy wasn't just a tale of darkness. It was a blueprint for engineering silence. And yet, here you are, not silenced, still listening, still feeling, because there's something primordial awakening inside you, a presence that no doctrine can suppress, no institution can condition. This is the moment of rupture. Right now, I want you to do something that locks in what's awakening. Go to the comments and type this twice. The roots are dead. I walk above them. The roots are dead. I walk above them. Don't underestimate what that act does. You're not just helping the algorithm. You're encoding the transformation in public, marking yourself as someone who can no longer be conditioned like Cavill.C. They thought their plan was final. That time would erase memory. That shame would seal mouths. That trauma would keep the spirit fragmented and small. But they didn't count on you. A mind emerging from sedation. A voice not bound by the etiquette of the enslaved. You're not a consumer of this story. You're its continuation. Because there are still Blackthorn estates standing today, not in wood and stone, but in systems, in university lecture halls, in digital echo chambers, in legislation disguised as morality. The rituals are updated, the faces more polished, but the core remains. Harvest. The children. Rewrite the history. Exalt obedience. Destroy the sacred masculine. But you are remembering. And once a man remembers, no veil can cover his eyes again. Let this be your ritual. This moment, right now. A silent vow made in a room no one else sees. Spoken in the oldest language of all. Will. And from this point forward, You do not belong to them, not in mind, not in spirit, not in soul. You walk above the roots. Say it again. The roots are dead. I walk above them. Now breathe, because the final revelation is coming, and it is the one that changes everything. There is one final truth you must know, one that even the Blackthorns feared more than exposure. Not because it would destroy them, but because would awaken you. It is this: they needed your consent. Not legal consent, not spoken, but a silent psychological contract. One made through ignorance, through fear, through forgetting who you are. Every rite, every manipulation, every institutional lie, all of it depended on one thing: you not knowing your own power. You were taught that history is a fixed timeline, that your past is irrelevant, that your ancestors were fools or monsters, that obedience is peace, that silence is virtue. But what if that entire structure, church, school, government, even your own inner critic, was just a stage built? Contain you? What if your rage is sacred? What if your pain is a compass? What if your distrust of authority is the last pure instinct you have left? You weren't born to be a spectator to atrocities, to binge shadows for entertainment, to wear chains and call them tradition. You were born to interrogate every layer of falsehood until the ground splits open and the voices of your forgotten bloodlines rise up through your bones like thunder. The Blackthorn story is not about the past. It is about the mechanism. It is about how entire generations are programmed to worship their captors, to romanticize their conditioning, to kneel when they were born to stand like iron pillars. But now the story ends. And when it does, something must begin. Not for the world, for you. So when you close this video, don't scroll, don't distract, sit in the silence. Let the weight of truth etch itself into your awareness. And if something inside you feels unsettled, if your stomach twists, if your hands tremble, good, that means it reached you. That means you're still human. That means you're not one of them. The Blackthorns built a dynasty on silence. But you remember. And that is the most dangerous thing in the world. Now go, and never be the same again.